You know, I was really considering making a Patreon account. I was. I really was. I'm just gonna blame my 3-month hiatus on the fact that I currently have 2 jobs. Not bad, but it has been killing my channel. But in the wake of what's gone on in these past couple of weeks with Sargon's deplatforming from Patreon and PayPal needlessly axing their relationship with Subscribestar, it's about time I broke radio silence. For those of you who may not be aware, Sargon of Akkad's Patreon channel was taken down about 3 weeks ago after a clip from 10 months ago surfaced of him calling white nationalists a racial epithet. This was done, as Patreon has stated, because in saying this, Sargon, or rather his brand, has engaged in hate speech against a marginalized group, or something along those lines. First question that springs to mind, though, does Patreon really want to look like they're in defense of white ethnostatists? Seriously, though, there's been a lot of content creators weighing in on the fact that Patreon decided to terminate a user's account based on what they did off that platform. Sargon himself, along with PewDiePie and V, have called this action unfair and chilling, as it implies that Patreon is watching everything you do to determine whether or not you deserve your income, while Tim Pool and YouTuber Law have focused on the vague yet layered structure of Patreon's terms of service and deemed that the platform is not a safe place to engage in business. I'll include a link down below to a discussion of Patreon and PayPal's actions between YouTuber Law and Tim Pool, as it really gets into the potential legal damages that Patreon could be putting themselves into. Now, what's really shed some light on how Patreon's trust and safety team sorts through accounts that it wants to keep or get rid of is a video released today by Matt Christiansen where he goes over a transcript of a conversation between himself and Jacqueline Hart. Hart is the head of the TNS team at Patreon, and while I'll include a link to Matt's video in the description as well as the transcript so you can see everything in context, there are a few things I want to touch on in terms of how badly Patreon is running itself as a business. First, there's the question of Patreon's purpose, or as they put it, their mission. When asked about Patreon's take on political creators and free speech, Hart states, "The problem is Patreon takes payments. And while we are obviously supportive of the First Amendment, there are other things that we have to consider. Our mission is to fund the creative class. In order to accomplish that mission, we have to build a community of creators that are comfortable sharing a platform, and if we allow certain types of speech that some people would call free speech, then only creators that use Patreon, that don't mind their branding associated with that kind of speech, would be those who use Patreon, and we fail at our mission." There's some faulty logic at play in how Hart words this. There's an implicit assumption that on Patreon, because it's considered a community, every creator is fully aware of what every other creator is doing. That's something no user, nor even Patreon's TNS team, is capable of keeping track of, and for the most part, I bet you that most users just don't care. If I were to use Patreon to fund videos like this, I wouldn't care in the least if the user below my name on the list were using Patreon to fund indie porn flicks. What others do on Patreon doesn't and shouldn't concern anyone else. Hart also states that payment processing is one of Patreon's core values. Well, which is it then? Does Patreon want to be a platform for creators or a payment processor for them? The TNS team seems to hold these two aspects in high regard but doesn't act accordingly, favoring the community over payment processors. A little nugget that slipped out in the conversation which I found interesting is what Hart says about the decision to ban Sargon being Patreons alone. In Tim Pool's talk with YouTuber Law, they float the idea that Sargon's ban and PayPal's subsequent severed ties with Subscribestar could potentially violate antitrust laws. Hart states that Patreon chose to ban Sargon alone, but when Matt mentions that payment processors should be irrelevant, Hart says that they don't make the rules, that there's an extra layer of compliance from Visa, MasterCard, PayPal, or Stripe, whatever payment processor you want to insert. Now what that sounds like to me is that Patreon pulled the trigger on Sargon's account in order to avoid fallout from payment processors. Hart states that being, quote, 100% dedicated to free speech isn't really true to our mission. I fail to see how any company can claim a desire to fund the, quote, creative class while not being dedicated to the idea of freedom of expression. Hart states that Patreon wants to fund as many creators as possible. I don't see how a company can do that while maintaining a limited stance on freedom of speech. If creativity is protected by the First Amendment, then it seems fair to me that a company should have no problems being committed to freedom of speech. Apparently I'm wrong. Next on my little hit list is Patreon's enforcement of its own rules. The first red flag that went up for me was what Jack Conte said during his interview with Dave Rubin in 2017.
Is there any type of person right now that would set bells off just by setting up a Patreon account? So the easiest example I can give you is if Milo Yiannopoulos today was like, all right, I'm jumping on Patreon. Is there an inherent problem there?
So there are lots of people that would set bells off by setting up Patreon pages. Terrorists, money launderers,
right? So
fraudsters.
removing the strictly illegal people up to illegal activities, removing those people. Somebody that happens to be controversial, someone who I expect from looking at your Twitter that you probably are not a big fan of. Let's say someone like Milo. Would that set off any bells internally as to can we even go about doing this? Because the same people that really don't like Lauren, or the same people that like Lauren like Milo, obviously.
Yeah. Again, what I would say is, and see, here's the other thing I think people don't understand about these sorts of decisions. This is not my job, right? I don't do our content policy. Our team does our content policy. So here's what I would say. If there were lots of incoming reports, they would look at a bunch of evidence, they'd make a determination, and they'd make a decision one way or the other after we investigated it thoroughly. I don't know.
It's fair to me for a CEO of a company to say, look, banning creators isn't my job. That's a perfectly reasonable answer. What I don't like is the fact that Conte never states what the values of his company are. He simply offloads that to his trust and safety team and wipes his hands of it. That's not a good move for a CEO to make. Conte should know exactly by what constraints on content his TNS team is operating, even if it's only one or two things. That whole video about manifest observable behavior of his, Conte doesn't adhere to it, and I'll get into how a little later on. One of Sargon's complaints about his ban is that it was not made clear that content hosted off-platform could be deemed as not complying with Patreon's terms of service. The stream in which Sargon was involved was on YouTube, and at no point was it ever uploaded to Patreon as paid content. As it stands now, all of Patreon's terms and conditions are worded in application to content uploaded strictly to Patreon and nowhere else. Yet Sargon's account was terminated for things said off that platform. And this is where any potential trust I may have had in Patreon begins to evaporate. In an email conversation with Tim Pool, Conte stated that he knows full well that Patreon's terms of service are poorly written. This, to me, is the mark of an irresponsible CEO. If you know that your rules aren't clear enough, it is unethical to enforce them. A subjective law is about as useful as no law at all. Yes, businesses do have a right to refuse service to anyone. However, the problem here is the principle of how Patreon is exercising that right. I could dig up multiple accounts in clear violation of Patreon's conditions on adult content and hate speech, yet nothing's been done about them. As iDubbbz put it, it's either all okay or none of it's okay. Additionally, in the transcribed conversation between Matt Christiansen and Jacqueline Hart, Hart states that Patreon's rules are applied in a case-by-case manner, not in a uniform fashion. Yes, we would love for it to be a uniform standard for everyone, but as you might imagine, it's quite difficult to make something so granular, and I actually don't know if we want to go that direction because it takes the human element out of it. You want to add a human element, Hart? Sargon has a wife and kids. I can play the emotional damage card too. You've just cut off a man from his livelihood over a single word. Do you not understand how petty that sounds? Combing through the rest of the transcript, Matt and Hart bring up the topic of the appeals process. Now I understand that Sargon currently has no plans to return to Patreon given how he's been treated, but Hart states that every user is permitted one chance to appeal. Sargon's appeal process came down to one thing: prove to us that what you said isn't hate speech. Given that hate speech itself is a subjective term, which Hart admits, that is a near impossible standard to reach. Hart does mention that Sargon could get his page back if he were to issue an apology explaining that he doesn't normally say those things or act in that manner, essentially a disavowal of his language. However, elsewhere she states that Patreon takes a creator's full body of work into account upon deciding to punish a user. Now this is where Conte's rule of manifest observable behavior should come into play, but instead seems to be ignored. If it were true that Patreon takes a user and their actions into account, then Patreon should be able to take Sargon's body of work, i.e. his entire YouTube channel, into account and see that Sargon normally does not conduct himself in that manner. So which one is it, Jacqueline Hart? Which one is it, Patreon? If you're inviting us to play a game with our money where you set a vague set of rules that are constantly subject to change, nobody's going to want to play your game. That's why you're getting a Patrexit in droves that's bleeding funds from unrelated channels. Attempts like this to reach out to creators such as Tim Pool and Matt Christiansen in order to assure them that they aren't next in line is about as effective as taking an aspirin for the foot you just shot off. All you've done is prove that you have no standards, which is a move that no business in its right mind would ever make. You've lost sight of your original mission as a financial service for independent creators in favor of a hard-left, politically correct ideology. What's that phrase that the Quartering keeps using? Oh, right. Get woke, go broke. I'll be watching this from the sidelines, waiting to see what sort of damage control Patreon attempts from here on out. I'd really like to get paid for this sort of stuff, for the 3D renders, the videos, all of it. Great fucking job, Patreon. You really, really thought this one through. Thank you so very much for watching. Hit that like button if you enjoyed this video, feel free to subscribe for future content, and leave a comment if you want to jump in on the conversation. If you want more of me, I co-host the Locked and Loaded podcast with two very good friends of mine every Monday at 6 p.m. Pacific. You can find a link to that down below.